present Dr. Jose Edgar Aban. He is one of my colleagues and a fellow geographer at UOG. Dr. Aban is a seasoned research and project manager and an advocate of satellite remote sensing education. He served for almost 2 decades at the Department of Science and Technology of the Philippines and has taught as a senior lecturer in the Department of Geography, Development, and Environmental Studies at the University of Brunei, where he was instrumental in establishing their image processing laboratory. Prior to joining the University of Guam, Dr. Aban served as a technical consultant at the Asian Development Bank. He was the project manager of the GIS-based project called Communication and Information Systems for the Control of Avian Influenza. And he was also a consultant of a mapping unit of an agricultural company in Indonesia. Dr. Aban's research interests include land use and land cover change analysis, global change analysis, ecosystems change analysis, and the development of pre-processing algorithms for noise reduction in satellite images, climate change impacts modeling with the use of digital elevation modeling, climatic oscillations, drones, and many more. So Dr. Aban will be providing this workshop on LIDAR. So take it away, Dr. Aban.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction about myself, Dr. Romina, my very, very gracious colleague at the geography program. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity and pleasure to share some of my little knowledge, still little about LIDAR, but basically it's one of the areas that's really very, very timely with the use of remote sensing. And, you know, everything is now being globalized with the new satellites that are coming in, and even popularized with the use of UAVs and drones. Okay. So this afternoon's session will actually focus on the use of one particular sensor called LIDAR, what LIDAR is. Okay. And this is some sort of a pre-conference workshop and seminar in order that people may have a sort of a foretaste as to what LIDAR can actually do and is capable of doing. Okay. So my complete name is Jose Edgardo L. Aban, and I'm with the geography program of University of Guam. So the outline of today's seminar workshop would focus on these major points. Intro to basic remote sensing. We need to know what remote sensing is before we even go into a deep dive into what LIDAR is and what are DEMs, or digital elevation models. We'll also go into the basics of LIDAR, what it is, because that's the main meat of our today's session on LIDAR remote sensing. Of course, the most important part would be how you as a user will be able to explore and exploit those freebies, those free sources of LIDAR software that can process this type of data, as well as which websites can you actually download freebies of LIDAR datasets. And today's workshop is also designed to give you a foretaste of these particular softwares, which are free and open source softwares that can actually do a lot of image processing in terms of LIDAR, not only by processing of LIDAR, but also it can also process most of the remote sensing images and GIS data. Okay. There will be a live demonstration of that. And of course, what are the applications of LIDAR? And lastly, sources of free LIDAR data. Now, before we discuss more detailed information on LIDAR, okay, it's important for us to have a basic definition about remote sensing. As you wake up in the morning, open your eyes, use your cell phones to take a photograph, and these are basically forms of day-to-day or mundane remote sensing. Photography and vision are two basic forms of remote sensing. Now, put at a higher level, satellite remote sensing makes use of the electromagnetic radiation wavelengths. Since our eyes are only sensitive to a small portion of the electromagnetic radiation wavelength, which comes basically naturally from the sun, we need specialized sensors that can actually be able to image or capture information beyond the wavelengths to which our vision is actually sensitive to. So our vision is actually sensitive to a very small sliver of the electromagnetic radiation. It's around, technically speaking, it's around 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers in terms of the electromagnetic radiation wavelength. Okay? And anything shorter than that and longer than 0.7 micrometers, our eyes are actually blind to it, unable to see those kinds of electromagnetic radiation wavelengths. That's why with the inception or creation of satellite cameras, these are able to actually capture wavelengths beyond that which we can see with our sense of vision. And just to familiarize to you, some of the common wavelengths that are used in remote sensing is of course the visible wavelengths, okay, which our eyes are sensitive to, and most importantly are the longer wavelengths like infrared, which our eyes are not sensitive to. We cannot see infrared. That's why we need the specialized cameras to do that. And microwave, this is in the realm of radar and microwave, as well as some sensors are also sensitive to ultraviolet. Okay. So just to give you the context by which we actually use remote sensing, for us to be able to sense and observe phenomena which are beyond our sense of vision. Okay. Now, in remote sensing, there are basically two types of remote sensing based on the source. Okay. One is called passive remote sensing, in which case you have basically three elements: the source of the electromagnetic radiation, which is the natural source, is of course the sun. And you have the object to be sensed. In this case, we have the surface of the earth. So all phenomena that is occurring or is present on the surface of the earth can actually be imaged using remote sensing. And the EMR, or the electromagnetic radiation that is reflected back, is the one that's actually captured by the sensor, in this case, a satellite, okay, or a UAV. Okay. In this kind of remote sensing setup, we call this passive simply because the electromagnetic radiation is naturally occurring or coming from the sun. Okay, that's why it's passive. And the sensor just captures this reflected radiation, which we call as albedo or reflectance. Okay. Now, there's the other type of a remote sensing type based on the source. It's called an active remote sensing. In this case, the sensor or the platform itself, in this case, the satellite, is the source of the electromagnetic radiation, or the pulse, or the signal. So it sends out this pulse from the satellite or the airborne platform, an aircraft or a UAV, sends out a pulse, and the pulse is reflected back by the Earth's surface, and that same sensor receives the reflected radiation. So in this case, the sensor is the emitter and the receiver of the electromagnetic radiation pulse or signal. And this type of radiation is called, this type of remote sensing is called active remote sensing. Okay. Why I'm discussing this? Because we need to know or contextualize LIDAR. LIDAR is an active form of remote sensing in which light impulses are actually emitted by the, it can be an airborne, an airplane, or it can be a UAV, or it can even be a satellite. It actually emits LIDAR pulses, and it's the same platform that receives those LIDAR pulses or signals. That's why it's an active form of remote sensing. Now, the passive types of remote sensing are the old generation types of satellites, like the likes of Landsat. You may have heard of those satellites, very, very old and still functioning satellites. Yeah, you may have heard about French satellite Spot. Okay. These are all passive remote sensing. And the more modern or the newer remote sensing platforms are called active remote sensing platforms, among which is, of course, LIDAR, which is our topic for today. Now, this is some sort of a crash course on remote sensing. We actually have a whole semester of around 4 months to discuss about the principles of remote sensing. But just to contextualize what we're talking about, in remote sensing, we actually capture that EMR, the electromagnetic radiation reflection, or the reflection that's coming from objects on the surface of the Earth. And different objects behave differently depending on the electromagnetic radiation wavelength that is incident on that particular object. Okay? That's the beauty of remote sensing. You can actually distinguish each of those objects based on its spectral response, or more commonly called spectral signature. Okay? And this is just a snapshot of some of the, you would say, ideal types of surfaces or common types of surfaces that we would observe on a satellite images. For example, vegetation is quite commonly a topic or a subject to be studied in remote sensing. Water, of course, and soil. And each of these objects, each of these surfaces have their own specific spectral signature, and they behave differently as you go from the shorter wavelengths up to the longer wavelengths of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. That's why earlier on, I have floated the information about EMR, because there are short wavelengths EMR and long wavelengths EMR, and our eyes are sensitive just to a small sliver of that EMR. Okay? And objects also have different behavior, okay, in terms of their reflectance, okay, with the EMR's different wavelengths. And as you go from short to long wavelengths, this signature has peaks and valleys. Okay? And most importantly, in remote sensing, we are very much interested in studying the spectral signature of vegetation. Okay? So here you have a curve. We call this in remote sensing spectral curve, okay? Where the y-axis gives you the reflectance, or the amount of radiation that's reflected backed by a specific object. Okay? So it ranges from 0 to 100% reflectance. And the x-axis here is the EMR wavelength, or the electromagnetic radiation wavelength. So this is shorter to longer wavelengths. And you can see here, the green spectral curve here represents vegetation or plants. Okay, so this is a very idealized curve. Very, you would say, it's a signature curve of plants. There are certain peaks and valleys in this particular curve. One such peak or increased reflectance is here. This corresponds to around 0.5 micrometers in terms of wavelength of the EMR. And this is actually corresponding to the green response of green reflectance of plants. If you recall, our eyes are sensitive to wavelengths from 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers. And that's our sense of vision. And 0.5 happens to be within that range. And 0.5 micrometers corresponds to the green wavelengths of the EMR. That's why we see with our eyes plants to be green, simply because we are sensitive to seeing green, which is 0.5 micrometers here, this small peak in the reflectance. Now, after that, there's a dip or valley or an absorption of EMR. And this corresponds to the wavelength of red. So here, actually, red wavelengths are being absorbed by plants. And we don't see that simply because red wavelengths are absorbed by plants and they use it for photosynthesis. So the misnomer that green plants actually use green wavelengths for photosynthesis is somewhat shattered. Okay, it's actually the red wavelengths that plants use for you would say more efficiently. They use red wavelengths for photosynthesis. And if you happen to have watched a video whereby plants are being reared inside a laboratory, a culture in a laboratory that's all red, LED lights that are all red, simply because plants can photosynthesize under red wavelengths of light. Okay. Now, after the red wavelengths here, there's an increased reflectance, meaning after the red, there's the infrared, and the infrared is now being reflected back by plants. And we see this particular, you would say, increase in reflectance in the infrared. However, our eyes cannot see that. Our eyes are simply not designed to see infrared. That's why sensors have been designed to capture that phenomena of plants emitting or reflecting back a huge amount of infrared. And this next slide would actually show to you a tree and a scenery, which is a scenery of a prairie, perhaps, and it shows you an infrared image of that particular prairie. And why you ask is that are the plants and the trees very bright? Simply because plants, vegetation, reflect a huge amount of infrared. That's why they're bright in this particular image. And this image was captured using infrared. Okay, so this bright pixels that you see here are actually reflectance of vegetation in the infrared wavelengths. Okay. Now, quickly, there are also other. No, before going to the other substances, this particular curve is very useful in being able to monitor the health or the condition of plants, and it's a very vital tool to assess the productivity of plants. Okay, how the slope changes with the condition of the plant. If the plant is actually stressed, needs more water or less moisture, or it's about to senesce or die or something like that, it can actually change. The spectral signature is actually a very useful tool in remote sensing to be able to assess the condition of plants. Now, quickly, there are also other spectral signatures being shown here, and among which is signature of soil. And in this case, most of the soil's spectral signature is actually reflects a huge amount of EMR in all wavelengths, be it short or long. Okay. There's some sort of absorption in the shorter wavelengths, but most of the longer wavelengths are actually reflected back by soil. And the cyan curve here represents turbid water, and the blue curve here represents clear water. Okay, you see that the presence of silt or sediments changes the spectral signature of water itself. Okay, so these are vital indicators of the condition of a particular substance. Okay, so that's spectral signature, which is I would say, one of the core concepts that must be learned in remote sensing. Okay? Now, each of those substances, okay, have their own spectral signature, and it's very useful in geology, particularly, that each of those minerals that are present in a particular rock behaves differently. Okay? Again, based on the principle of spectral radiometry and spectral response. So we can actually differentiate different types of minerals or rocks based on its spectral signature alone. Okay, we've seen that. Now, in remote sensing, it's actually a system. Remote sensing is not just the image that we will be using later in a practical demonstration, but it's actually a series of steps and processes. It's a whole system from acquisition. Okay? We have data acquisition, which is a huge part of the remote sensing system. We have the EMR source, which is the sun, in a passive remote sensing setup, or an active remote sensing setup where the source of the electromagnetic radiation is the platform itself. There's the data ground receiving station, where information is actually relayed and received by the ground receiving stations. And this data has to be pre-processed or quality controlled, simply because the data also suffers from some sort of error. Okay? So there is pre-processing that has to be made, since in most cases, data actually suffers from technical or systemic errors. Okay? Then once it's quality controlled, the image can actually be released for public consumption or public use. And the images that we will be playing with later are actually pre-processed data that's released for public consumption. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what a remote sensing system actually looks like. Now, here's a very nice video which should somewhat gel all things together, the concepts which I just talked about. Okay.
Hi, I'm Emerald Robinson, and in this What Is video, we'll try to answer the question, what is remote sensing? Remote sensing is any technique used to gather information about an object that does not require touching the object. Remote sensing can be done with devices either on the ground or on ships, planes, or even satellites. There are two parts to remote sensing. First, devices record radiation like light or heat from an object or area. And second, this data is analyzed to determine what it means. For simplicity, we can divide all of the devices used in remote sensing into two groups. In passive remote sensing, technology is used to record an object's natural radiation. An infrared camera on a tripod that records heat coming from a rock formation or an airplane flying over a rainforest that registers the sunlight reflected from the forest's canopy are examples of passive remote sensing. Active remote sensing takes place when a device sends out a signal in order to gather information about an object. A ship that sends sonar waves to scan the ocean floor uses active remote sensing, as do satellites that monitor hurricanes. Although you may not realize it, you benefit from the results of remote sensing almost every day. Meteorologists count on it to help generate weather forecasts. Police use it to catch speeding cars, and geologists use it to create maps of all kinds. A special type of remote sensing called light detection and ranging, or LIDAR, is a type of active remote sensing that uses lasers. LIDAR is used by everyone from farmers to help fertilize their crops to engineers who use it to help them survey the land. In fact, you're using a type of passive remote sensing right now. Human eyes and ears capture light and sound waves and allow us to detect information about an object without even touching it.
For thousands of how-to and advice videos on any topic, visit monkeysee.com.
Okay, now let's move on. So that's in a very quick run through what remote sensing is. The second topic under this is what are DEMs, or digital elevation models. And these are actually products coming out of LIDAR. Okay? There are other sources of digital elevation models. Before LIDAR came, actually, we were using radar as a source of DEMs. Okay, but we're not going to discuss about radar. We're basically focused on LIDAR. And DEMs are basically byproducts of LIDAR technology. DEMs are digital representations of topography. And these are cells based with single elevation representing the entire cell, the entire area of the cell. Okay. And basically in remote sensing jargon, we're talking about digital numbers. So each of those images that you see in front of you is composed of picture elements, which we call as pixels. Okay? Pixels, and each of those pixels that form these images that you see in front of you is composed of a digital number, or a digital representation of intensity. So if you zoom into an image, zoom so close, and zoom into your computer, not really zoom into your computer, but if you look at the language of the computer, it's actually a set of numbers inside of those pixels, and each of those pixels have a value which we call as digital number. Okay, and in this case, a DEM is a representation of height. Okay, each of those values of digital number represent height. Okay, so when we zoom into an image, you actually sort of look into the digital number values which represent height. The higher the digital number, the higher the height. It's simply like that. And also DEM provides position. So each of those pixels represent a specific position in a particular image. Okay? So this pixel here has a particular digital number and has a particular you would say address or position that it represents. This one as well, and this one as well. Okay. So that's digital elevation models. These are basically representations of heights of topography. And uses of DEMs basically are used for watershed analysis. They basically are very useful tools for terrain characteristics of slope, watershed analysis, drainage networks, and stream channels. So for those of you who are hydrologists or working on river networks, this is a very vital tool. And of course, for those who are doing civil work, civil engineers, DEMs are also useful since it provides the topographic or the terrain onto which you can build infrastructure. Okay, so DEMs are vital information for GIS. Now, we now go into LIDAR. Okay? What is LIDAR? The basics of LIDAR. I figure that it's significant to flash this particular image. Okay? You may be familiar with it. It's not my brain, by the way. It's not my MRI image. Just to give you some sort of an analogy, that in medical imaging, we can do MRI or magnetic resonance imaging, or another technology is CT scan or CAT scan, in which we can actually make slices of the human body without even physically slicing it out. Okay, so basically, MRI is able to slice or segment the internal organs of the body by just providing pulses of electromagnetic radiation onto the body, okay, and receiving those information, and you come up with these slices of the human body, dissecting it into its different components. In this case, a dissection of the human brain without physically dissecting the body itself. And I see a clear analogy with this one simply because LIDAR remote sensing can also do this. It can actually slice up or give different images of layers that are seemingly invisible, okay, with the classical techniques of remote sensing. It can actually slice up a particular terrain in terms of the ground, the low vegetation, medium vegetation, and the highest vegetation, or buildings, as well as different topographic characteristics. So LIDAR can actually slice the terrain. It can slice the area into different, you would say, levels. Okay, that's why I find it very useful, if not significant, to actually make an analogy between MRI and LIDAR. Okay. So what is LIDAR? LIDAR is an acronym or a shortcut for light detection and ranging. It's a form of active remote sensing, which you know now, wherein the EMR actually comes from the sensor itself, and it's the same sensor that actually receives the reflected light. Okay, and one particular use of LIDAR is that it can actually measure tree height. Okay, not only can it measure tree height, it can actually measure the topography of the ground quite accurately. Okay, quite accurately, and we will see that in the coming slides. So these are just some of the key points I'll be discussing about LIDAR. What is LIDAR? The key attributes of LIDAR, how LIDAR data are used to measure trees, and how we can access software and LIDAR data. Okay. For us scientists, we need to cover a huge area of survey. Okay. One of the difficulties of scientists when they do large area surveys is they need for one, a lot of manpower. Two, a project usually has limited time. And of course, three, a project would usually have limited budget. So given those constraints, and particularly given the manpower limitations as well as time, one of the solutions for doing this is actually to use remote sensing technology to be able to cover a wide area in just a short time as much as possible. That's why remote sensing is actually a synoptic technology, in that it can cover huge areas in just a flight of an airplane, or just a snapshot of an image of a satellite. Okay. And this is one of the limitations of wide area surveys, okay? Particularly surveys which are inaccessible for legwork or footwork to be done in areas where there's really rough terrain, thick woods, thick forests. It's almost impossible to do a real, you would say, detailed survey of an area. And the best way to do this is to use remote sensing, particularly to use LIDAR as a tool. Therefore, we need tools that would make it easier for us to make an estimate of an area, have key characteristics covered in just a short time, and large areas actually covered by images using LIDAR. And LIDAR can actually measure vegetation in terms of its height. Okay, one of the things that LIDAR can actually measure is tree height. Okay, it can measure vegetation or other areas across large areas, and we use remote sensing to do those. It can measure vegetation height, vegetation density, and even be able to derive such information like the topography or the terrain characteristics in very, very high resolution topo maps. Here's a good video I was able to capture from the internet.
Trees are really important to us humans. They produce that delicious oxygen that we love so much. They also clean the air, removing both pesky pollutants and elements like carbon dioxide. You know, those things that have been linked with sad polar bears and warming climates? And if that's not enough of a service to society, trees happily slurp up and filter rainwater as it runs along the ground, protecting us from floods. And they even block our sensitive human exteriors from those outdoor elements like wind and sun. The importance of trees to us humans inspires scientists to measure and inventory them across the globe, to identify where trees are and where they're not, where they've been damaged, cut down, or burned, and where they're growing strong. However, trees cover almost a third of the Earth's surface. That's 29.5%, or 9.5 billion acres. That equals 750 million football fields of trees. So how does a scientist measure 750 million football fields worth of trees across the globe? Well, one way to measure trees around the world is to get a whole lot of graduate students together, and maybe a few other volunteers, in one organized tree measuring effort. But maybe that's not such an efficient approach. A more efficient way to measure trees and other objects, like buildings on the ground, is to use remote sensing technology. Remote meaning to observe and measure something from afar, as opposed to with our hands. One type of remote sensing data used to measure tree height over the entire country is called LIDAR, the topic of this video. LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging. A LIDAR system uses light energy emitted from a laser to scan the Earth's surface and record the heights of objects, like trees and buildings, on the ground. The LIDAR also works together with a global positioning system, or GPS receiver, to identify the location of those things on the ground. The use of a laser to actively produce light energy makes LIDAR an active remote sensing system. While LIDAR technology is exciting, it certainly isn't new. In fact, the earliest laser remote sensing systems date back to the 1960s. During the 1970s, they were used to measure ground elevation and produce the earliest high-resolution elevation maps. But LIDAR still wasn't being used to measure trees. The most common early use of LIDAR data was to produce beautiful high-resolution elevation maps that clearly identified the dips and peaks of hills and mountains with a level of detail that hadn't been seen before in science. And talk about useful, they even documented where stream channels and roads were. The detail and accuracy that LIDAR data provided with these high-resolution elevation datasets made people excited to work with LIDAR-derived elevation maps. How could you not be? Now, in LIDAR's early stages, the vegetation information contained in the data was considered noise, and people worked hard to remove as much of the noise as possible in order to create the most refined topographic maps. But alas, it was realized over time that within that noise was valuable information about vegetation. And soon it was discovered that LIDAR could be used to measure things like tree height and vegetation density and cover. And so the value of LIDAR data to better measure topography, vegetation, and even buildings was realized, and the use of LIDAR data in science took off. To make this a modern-day story, we can now use information about vegetation found in LIDAR data to study large-scale ecological issues. For example, we can use LIDAR data to estimate the impact of fire on a forest, identifying how many trees still exist compared to how many burned away. Or we can use LIDAR data to estimate where certain wildlife species might prefer to live and reproduce. We can even use LIDAR-derived tree heights to estimate ecological metrics, like vegetation density or biomass over large areas. Information that can help us better understand carbon cycles and in turn relate to changes in our climate. But wait, there's more. We can also collect LIDAR data over the same areas using the same settings over and over again through time. Maps of vegetation created over time allow us to identify and quantify changes that have occurred. And if that's not cool enough, LIDAR data allows us to create powerful visual animations that show trends in vegetation as it changes through time. Talk about a powerful ecological tool. So this ability to understand ecosystems over such large areas and through time makes LIDAR data extremely useful to ecologists. And this is why the National Ecological Observatory Network, otherwise known as NEON, is collecting LIDAR data that will be freely available over all of its core sites every year for 30 years. Now, we can't wrap this video up without taking a look at some LIDAR data collected using the NEON Airborne Observation Platform. Here are some data collected over Harwood Forest in Massachusetts. Notice how you can pick out and potentially measure individual trees in this video. Now imagine measuring all of those trees by hand.
Any questions so far at this point? Okay. Any questions, clarifications? Everything clear so far? Moderator, any questions on the chat box?
No questions on the chat box.
Thank you so much.
Carry on, Dr. Arlon.
Thank you. So as you can see, LIDAR is an active form of remote sensing. It's the LIDAR return, or the pulses that are received by the sensor at different intervals of time. That's what makes an image of a particular surface. And if you noticed, that particular image on the video, let me play that towards the end somewhat. And here, this particular scene actually shows you what are called LIDAR point clouds. So if you can look at them closely, these are actually point clouds that are hanging in space, and they represent elevation. Okay? So these are actually a cloud of points that's received by the sensor, reflected from the surface. Okay? And each of those points represent height information. Okay? And when we process these point clouds, okay, convert them from one format, which is a point cloud called the vector format. Again, this is somewhat a technical jargon. Vector is converted into a raster. Now we can actually manipulate that in terms of pixels. Okay? But just for your information, LIDAR, raw LIDAR data is actually coming in the form of what are called point clouds. Okay? Point clouds. Okay? A LiDAR system measures the time it takes for emitted light to travel to the ground and back. So it's basically working on the principle of the time it takes for that signal to be returned back as a reflected signal into the sensor itself. The time is used to calculate the distance traveled. This distance traveled is then converted into elevation. And the key components of a radar system, a LiDAR system, is basically a GPS. Inside the UAV or inside an airborne LiDAR is a GPS, or a global positioning system, that identifies the position of the sensor in terms of the XYZ location. Okay? In terms of its coordinate information as well as its altitude from the ground. Okay? The Z basically represents the altitude from the ground. And also it has a device called an internal measurement unit, or an IMU, which provides the orientation of the airplane or the UAV. Okay? Sometimes the UAV or the airplane wobbles, and in order to compensate for that wobbling or distortion that's introduced by the position or the wobbling movement of the airplane, an IMU actually works on that.
So LIDAR, or light detection and ranging, uses lasers to measure the elevation of things like the ground, forests, and even buildings. It's a lot like sonar, which uses sound waves to map things, or radar, which uses radio waves to map things, but a LIDAR system uses light, sent out from a laser. But aren't lasers used for stuff like, I don't know, scanning barcodes, making your favorite band look awesome, removing hair? Ew. Seriously, how does a LIDAR system use lasers to measure stuff? Now, just for the record, there are different ways to collect LIDAR data. From the ground, from an airplane, or even from space. Airborne LIDAR data are the most commonly available LIDAR data, and airborne LIDAR data will also be freely available through the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON, so we'll focus on that in this video. So to get how lasers are used to calculate height in airborne LIDAR, we need to understand the 4 parts of the system. First, the airplane contains the LIDAR unit itself, which uses a laser to scan the Earth from side to side as the plane flies. By the way, for you remote sensing geeks out there, the laser system uses either green or near-infrared light, because these wavelengths or types of light reflect strongly off of vegetation. The next component of a LIDAR system is a GPS receiver that tracks the altitude and XY location of the airplane. The GPS allows us to figure out where LIDAR reflections are on the ground. The third component of a LIDAR system is what's called an inertial measurement unit, or IMU. Not to be confused with EMU, an IMU. The IMU tracks the tilt of the plane in the sky as it flies, which is important for accurate elevation calculations. Finally, the LIDAR system includes a computer. The computer records all of that important height information that the LIDAR collects as it scans the Earth's surface. No computer, no data. It's as simple as that. Now you may be wondering, how do the laser, the GPS, the IMU, and the computer all work together to get us these fantastically useful LIDAR data sets? Well, the laser in a LIDAR system scans the Earth, actively emitting light energy towards the ground. Now, before we go any further, let's get two key LIDAR terms associated with this emitted light energy out of the way. You know, so we can speak LIDAR and all. First, let's define the word pulse. A pulse simply refers to a burst of light energy that is emitted by the LIDAR system. And second, let's define the word return. Return refers to reflected light energy that has been recorded by the LIDAR sensor. So pulses of light energy travel to the ground and return back to the LIDAR sensor. Now we're speaking LIDAR. Now all of this pulse and return business is great, but speaking the language doesn't give us height. To get height, the LIDAR system records the time that it takes for the light energy to travel to the ground and back. The system then uses the speed of light to calculate the distance between the top of that object and the plane. So let's break down what this distance calculation looks like. You take travel time, multiplied by the speed of light, divided by 2 since the light traveled to the ground and back. This calculation gives us how far the light actually traveled to the ground. So using this math, we know the distance between the plane and the ground. But we're not done just yet. How do we figure out the actual elevation of the ground? To figure out ground elevation, we take the plane's altitude, calculated using that GPS receiver. And then we subtract the distance that the light traveled to the ground. And that covers the basics of how a LIDAR system uses lasers to measure height. So now we've got the basics down, but there are two more things that a LIDAR system has to consider when calculating height. First, the plane rocks a bit in the sky as it flies due to turbulence in the air. These movements are recorded by the Inertial Measurement Unit, or IMU. No, not EMU, IMU, so that they can be accounted for when height values are calculated for each LIDAR return. And also, an airborne system scans the Earth from side to side to cover a larger area on the ground when flying. So while some light pulses travel vertically from the plane to the ground, or directly at nadir if we're still talking LIDAR lingo here, most pulses leave the plane at an angle or off nadir. So the system also needs to account for pulse angle when it calculates elevation. So let's put this all together one last time. The LIDAR system emits pulses of light energy towards the ground using a laser. It then records the time it takes for the pulse to travel to the ground and return back to the sensor. It converts this time to distance using the speed of light. The system then uses the plane's altitude, tilt, and the angle of the pulse to calculate elevation. It also uses a GPS receiver to calculate the object's location on the ground. All of this information is recorded on that handy-dandy computer, also mounted on the airplane. And that, my friends, is how a LIDAR system works. Now, there is one more component of a LIDAR system that makes it so useful. A pulse of light doesn't just reflect off of one thing, like the top of a tree, and yield one return. Sometimes a LIDAR pulse travels through things, like the gaps between tree branches and leaves. Think about standing on the forest floor and watching the sunlight filter through the tops of the trees, making the leaves and branches glow. So light energy that passes through the canopy reflects off of the branches and leaves within the canopy. This ability of a LIDAR system to travel through and record information starting from the top of the canopy, through the canopy, and all the way to the ground makes LIDAR systems unique and highly valuable to scientists studying trees. These returns from within the canopy tell us more about what's happening inside the forest, or the forest structure. For example, they can tell us about the shape of the trees, or the density of the leaves on the trees. They can sometimes even be used to estimate whether there's shrubs below the trees on the forest floor. But we'll save that topic of using LIDAR to estimate forest structure for another video. And now, my friends, you know how a LIDAR system generally works. And also, you can consider yourself fluent in the language of LIDAR.
Okay, I think that explains most of the principles behind LIDAR. Okay? It's the capability of LIDAR to actually penetrate through thick canopy, and the differences in time by which the return signals are received by the sensor determines the heights of those canopy as well as the understory, including the surface or the terrain under those trees. Okay, I think it's explained quite lengthily in that particular video. So basically, a LiDAR pulse, okay, goes to the canopy, goes through thick canopy, and even strikes the ground. And there are several returns that need to be captured by the sensor itself. Now, these differences in times by which the signal is received, okay, basically determines the canopy structure as well as the distance of the ground from the sensor itself. Now, in our exercise coming up in the next few minutes, we will be able to examine these particular returns and actually work on these particular returns of LiDAR and be able to actually slice up the canopy structure for a particular area that we are interested with. Okay. We'll be working on an area south of Guam called Atantano area, Atantano Reserve area, where I will be doing some sort of image processing over LiDAR. Now, the fourth return is usually representative of the ground. And the third return is usually representative of low vegetation. Second return is medium height vegetation. And the first return, which is the canopy, the topmost part of trees, is the first return, meaning it's the first signal that's actually received by the sensor itself. So the last return that's received is actually representative of the ground. That's the fourth return. And this gives us what are called, I mentioned a while ago, what are called point clouds. These are actually points of locations, okay, representing height information. We call them point clouds. And each of those point clouds represent a particular elevation on the ground. Okay? And there's a particular waveform shown here earlier by this particular figure. The waveform actually is what we use for remote sensing. Now, how do scientists use LiDAR? There are many uses of LiDAR. It's been spelled out in some of the videos earlier. One of the products coming out of LiDAR is actually the digital elevation models, which are digital representations of topography. It has a lot of applications and uses, of course, one of which is in hydrology as well as civil works. These are all useful. DEMs are also all useful for many applications. With LiDAR, you can actually measure or estimate canopy cover. It can actually be merged with other remote sensing satellite sources like multispectral data coming from Landsat. You merge them together, which we will be doing also in a few minutes how we can actually merge different sources of satellite data, merge them together with LIDAR, so you have a more dramatic representation of a particular area of research. You can actually measure leaf area index if you're doing some field work on forestry as well as for agriculture, measuring leaf area index, vertical forest structure. A lot of applications of LIDAR. Species identification. If we can actually merge LIDAR, which provides you the canopy structure with the multispectral response, meaning the signature, okay, merge them together with the multispectral image data, and you can come up with species identification of forests, okay. And we've been doing that in one of the projects I was or still involved with, okay, for structure and species identification. Okay. I think by now you know that it provides positional information. Okay. Now those signals can actually be classified. Okay. So those first return, second return, and third return, and fourth return can be classified in such a way that they will represent those representative vegetation types, including ground. So the process of separating those returns is called classification. Okay, classification. So basically, you can classify the first, the fourth return, which is the last return of signal, as ground. Third return as classified as low vegetation. Second return as medium height vegetation, and the last return as the top of the canopies. Okay, so that process of doing that is called classification. Okay. Now comes the most interesting part. Okay. We now know, we've just been discussing about an intro about remote sensing, what spectral signature is, what active and passive remote sensing is, what LIDAR is, what DAMs are, and hopefully we're ready to go into the water somewhat and get our hands or feet wet. Okay. And we will be doing some sort of a demonstration on the use of free and open source software, particularly on the use of QGIS and a software called a plug-in software called Rapid Lasso. Okay. Now, even before we go forward with using QGIS, there are several sources of free and open source software for processing LIDAR data. Okay. And these are just some of the software I know of. There may be others. Okay. Some of you in the audience may have been working with LIDAR already, and this is not extensive, okay, but these are the list of software which I have encountered so far during my practice of my profession. Okay. QGIS, my all-time favorite. I would say this helped me survive with my profession, QGIS. It's a free and open source software, no license needed, and equally very powerful and evolving through time. It evolves through time simply because there are a lot of, it's an open source, people are contributing to its further development. You know, when it's the community of users that develops plugins into the system. That's why it's a continuously dynamically evolving software. Okay? And the good thing about QGIS is that it works on several platforms or operating systems. So it comes in different flavors, and it can work with different OS operating systems such as Mac. There's a Mac version for it. There's a Linux or Linux version for it. There's a BSD version for it. So it comes in different flavors, and the updates and plugins just come in so fast. I cannot even cope up with the newer versions of QGIS. So like almost every 2 or 3 months, there's a new update, there's a newer version, a more powerful version of QGIS that's produced by the community of users. Okay? So you can download from this particular site. Rapid Lasso is a plug-in into QGIS, as well as a plug-in to most of the famous GIS software like ArcGIS. So Rapid Lasso particularly is a plug-in for LIDAR processing. You can come up with a plug-in that's free and can do some you would say, what's this? Some useful work on LIDAR, but it is limited because it has some limitations in terms of you'll know what it is later when you work on Rapid Lasso. But the free version actually works quite well. Okay, that's why it says here is limited use. It's a plug into QGIS as well as other softwares like ArcGIS. Fusion LiDAR I haven't used on that, but I've heard it's also a equally powerful tool. Fugro is also a limited use software. It's mainly used for viewing point clouds of LiDAR data. Licensed software are the following: ArcGIS, Global Mapper. I'm quite a frequent user of Global Mapper. It's also a very good software for LiDAR processing and imaging. So I also recommend the use of Global Mapper. Pix4D, a very expensive software, one of the most powerful but equally expensive software in the market. Agisoft, Pix4D and Agisoft are actually favorite softwares for UAV and drone applications. Okay. Also, they are licensed software. TerraSolid, also another one, also very robust LiDAR processing software, but equally expensive. Now comes the live demo, but before I go there, I think it would be useful for us to have probably a 2-minute break. Moderator, what do you think? We have a break?
I can poll the group. Does anyone need a quick break? It's about an hour long. We can, yes, let's do a break. Someone wanted a break. So we'll come back here in 5 minutes. It is 4:07 now.
Yes.
So we will start at 4:13.
4:13, okay. Copy that.
Let's get the party started.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much for taking in the questions from the chat box. Thank you, Dr. Romina.
No worries.
So basically, this demonstration on how QGIS, a very, very cool software, free and open source. You can use it as much as you want, an equally powerful software. It helped me survive a lot of projects that I had to do previously. So I really love this software. And I'm a champion of free and open source software, by the way, and free and open source data. So hopefully this demonstration will somewhat entice you or make you more interested in using QGIS and of course the plugins that come with it. And one of the plugins is actually this one. You can actually use the Google Hybrid as one of your plugins and put it as your backdrop. So to put our discussions into better context, I chose a place where we can actually have a good you would say terrain which would show up as a river channel and a set of canopies. So here's an area which I got involved with some months ago with GPT, the Guam Preservation Trust. Okay? And we were actually looking at this particular area to be able to hopefully find some archaeological artifacts or archaeological finds simply by using LIDAR, a non-intrusive, non-invasive remote sensing tool. So since LIDAR can actually penetrate through thick canopy and image the ground, this is a very good and useful tool to use. Okay, so without further ado, what can QGIS do with LiDAR data? First, you must be able to download QGIS. I've given you the link where you can download, as well as the Rapid Lasso plugin. So in QGIS, once you've installed it properly on your computer, you can actually manage plugins here by clicking on the menu on plugins. Okay? And is my plugin window showing up on your side? You should see this list of plugins. Moderator, is it showing up? You should see plugins in a list of plugins.
Yes,
that okay,
we
good.
can
Just
see.
want to check, because sometimes when you open a window, it doesn't automatically show up on the other end of the Zoom conference. Okay, there's a lot of plugins you can put into your QGIS, and among them is, of course, the last tools, which comes from Rapid Lasso website. Okay, and I've already installed it. Not to go into the details of how to install it, but basically just put it as a plugin. And there's a long list of things you can do with the last tools. Among those is, most importantly, you can actually use last tools to extract LiDAR data, which is in point cloud, and convert it into a DEM. Okay, and the way to do it is actually use this particular tool called last to dem, which is under that plugin. So you go to this processing toolbox of your QGIS and click on last to dem. Okay, last to dem tool. Okay, when you click on that, you are actually given this window. You just have to click this run new 64-bit executables, okay, and get to the directory where you actually have those last tiles, those point clouds, which are usually in the format of filename.las or filename.laz. So the extensions of LiDAR data or point cloud data are usually with extension of .las or .laz. In this case, the Guam data that we have has extensions of .laz, which is basically a compressed format of LiDAR cloud data, point cloud data. So in this case, the study area consists of 2 LiDAR tiles, which are designated this way: Guam 2012 tile number 69 and tile number 52, which corresponds to the area of Atantano. Okay, so I've been able to use tile number 2, okay, for example, which corresponds to the area of the riverbed in Atantano Reserve. Okay, so you click on that last file, okay, load it as the input last or last file data. I just get the defaults given by QGIS. One particular facility that you should be aware of here is labeled filter by return. So this menu gives you which which of the several returns which we spoke about a while ago should you use for classification. So the first return that I'd like to come out from the last file, which is the cloud data, the point cloud data, is the ground. And this corresponds to class 2 return. So in this case, I choose class 2, okay, and use that as the filter or the classification where I want to extract only the ground data, okay, ground return. So I don't change much of the default information here. Its attribute is elevation, actual values, still the default, and give it an output name. So if you click the output name, you can save it to a file, give it a file name, in which case I give it, say, Atantano ground, okay, ground DTM, okay, for example, okay. And okay, so I've made some conversions already to save time, okay. So what I will just do is basically load those data sets, okay. So this is just a quick run through on how you actually convert a last file, which is a point cloud data, into a TIFF file, a DEM, okay. So let's look at the DEM right now. So if I load that converted DEM, it actually should look something like this. Okay. So this is the DEM coming out of the last ground, the DEM, which represents the ground, okay? Just the ground information. This is the topography. So if you look at this, it can actually show you the outlines of the river itself, okay? This is the river system within the Atantano Reserve, and you can see in quite amazing detail the river system, okay? Remember, with the Google hybrid map, it's all covered with vegetation. It's all covered with vegetation, and interestingly enough, LIDAR can actually penetrate into those thick vegetation and get the return coming from the ground. So if we render this with a better rendition of a three-dimensional rendering, okay, you can do that in QGIS. You just click on Viewer and New 3D Map View. Okay, you can actually render a topography map into a three-dimensional display. So if I am to manipulate this information even further, I will use DEM as a display type and use the ground elevation data raster, which I converted from LAS into a TIFF file, okay, and use that as a display, okay. And I will exaggerate the number of pixels to 512, which is the best amount of pixels to render a particular three-dimensional DEM. I also exaggerate the vertical scale, for example, to increase the vertical exaggeration of the visualization and apply those quickly. So you can actually have a very decent three-dimensional rendition of that free LiDAR data using free LiDAR software, which is QGIS. Okay. I don't know if it's showing well on your side. Can you see that rendition? Is the DEM moving on your side? I'm actually.
Yes, we can see. It's moving.
So again, this is using just free and open source software. You can actually manipulate an image, go zoom in and zoom out. Okay, so you can actually do fly throughs and whatever you would say. Um, how do you call that? Intelligent as well as high high level imaging just by using QGIS and LAS tools. Okay, you can zoom in and zoom out particular terrain. Now that's the ground. Okay, I can also slice the data so that I can only show the canopy. Okay, which is the canopy, the last return of the LIDAR. Okay, the ground is the fourth return is the ground, and the first return is the canopy, which is the top of the trees. Okay, I can do that as well. So just by simply activating the canopy here. Now, how I did this, by the way, how I did the canopy classification is almost the same. You just do last to them. Let's go last to them. Same procedure. Load the tile of the last that you want to convert from a point cloud, which is this one, Guam 2012 tile number 69, for example, and load that. And in this case, you use the other sets of returns. Okay, this particular filter will now filter returns number 3, 4, and 5. Keep class 3, 4, and 5. These are the returns that would correspond to the canopy, the middle vegetation, the low vegetation, the middle vegetation, and the canopy. Okay. The keep class 2 is actually for the ground. The keep class 3, 4, and 5 represents low vegetation, medium vegetation, and high vegetation or canopy. Okay. So we choose keep class 3, 4, and 5. Okay. And of course, give it a file to save it into. In this case, I save it, for example, into a Tantano veg 2, for example. Okay, but then again, for quickness and simplicity, I've already made several files. Okay, just give you an idea how we actually do it. Okay, so I'll just load that one, the vegetation that's been extracted out of the point cloud. Okay. So if I click that one, activate it, see, this is now the layer or the classification that represents vegetation only, vegetation only. This one is ground only, topography only, and this is vegetation only. Do you see the difference? See the difference? It's vegetation. This is ground only, topography, and this is vegetation. There's a stark difference. See? Stark difference. So if I want to display this, okay, it's quite easy to do that. The same procedure, go to view, three-dimensional map view, and do it, give some rendering, some changes in terms of display, put it into a DEM raster layer, use the vegetation layer for the DM, okay, apply it, give it a better looking number sets of pixels, say 600, and a vertical scale of 2, meaning you exaggerate it twice from that of the normal. Okay, apply. Okay, and then again we can actually have a very decent. Okay, the term is decent. Yeah, I got the term. You can have a decent representation of canopy for that particular area in Atantano. Okay, so can you see that? Can you see a swirling image of canopy?
Yes, we can.
See, so all of this is done in free and open source software. That's the thing that's amazing about it. It's free, no expense. So that's what's exciting about it. It can do amazing renditions, 3D renditions with just free and open source software. Okay, we're not yet finished. We still have 30 minutes, by the way. I can now manipulate the data such that I can actually come up with what is called a canopy height model, or CHM. So for those of you who are working with forestry applications of remote sensing and GIS, you can actually extract the ground information and the height information from the canopy, and you can actually come up with an absolute value of the canopy in that particular area. You can actually measure the canopy heights in that particular area. And how to do that is actually a simple arithmetic procedure in QGIS. You already have two sets of raster data. One is the ground, and the other is the canopy, or the vegetation response or vegetation return. Okay? And we just have to subtract one from the other. And you can do that in QGIS simply by doing a raster calculator. Okay, in QGIS, it has a facility called raster calculator. You can actually subtract layers from one another. Okay? In this case, we subtract the layer from the vegetation, which is the first layer. Okay, just double click on that, minus, as in an arithmetic equation, minus the ground layer, or the ground raster from it. So basically, we're subtracting from one layer to the other, so we can get the height, or the canopy height, of that particular area, of the trees on that particular area. And of course, you can give it a name. And already, again, I've done a preloaded image just to be safe. So I'll just make it the new one. Okay. Just to, okay. And click OK. So we created a new file, and that's basically the Atantano new. So I'll not use that, but I'll use the one I made earlier, okay, because it takes time to render it. Okay. So here's the canopy height model derived from the two previous layers, and it basically provides you height information about the trees, absolute height information. And how do I know that? You can actually see these sets of legends here, that in this particular image, okay, the lowest trees that are present in this particular image is around 4.5 meters, this one. And the highest trees, which are in yellow, these yellow areas here, are sort of the highest trees in that image. It's around 18.5 meters. Do you see that legend on the left side of your screen? This is basically information about the heights. Do you see that? Moderator, can you confirm? Hello?
Yes, we can see that. Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. Yes, we can see.
So this is basically a canopy height model that can actually extract information from LIDAR, and it's an absolute quantification of volume. Imagine if you're a forester and you're required by your boss to quantify the amount of timber that can be extracted from this so-and-so reforestation project, and you're given just 3 months to do so, and the area is like thousands of acres or thousands of hectares to actually inventory. And here you go, you have a tool, you have a data set that you can actually manipulate and actually extract information quite intelligently, and quite, you would say, exact and a good approximation of what can be found in reality. Okay, so this even gets more exciting if we actually uh, join LiDAR data with other sources of data. For example, satellite data from, say, Landsat, or satellite data from Spot, satellite data from other satellite sources like Worldview 3 or Worldview 2, merge it together to come up with a very nice rendered image. I'll give a good source of rendering. We can actually use Google Hybrid, okay, plug in here, which I can just activate and deactivate in QGIS. And we will try to merge this so that we can come up with a nice three-dimensionally rendered image of the Atantano Reserve. Okay, it's taking time. Should go BDD, okay? Let me do that again. So it's loading some tiles.
Dr. Aban, while
Yes.
it's loading, would you be able to field a question?
Sure.
So Mike Yowell is asking if we are able to see evidence of the rerouting of the stream southwest of the Atentano to flow into the Atentano. I guess the military had done this between 1945 and 1950. If we zoom into your bare earth model, would we be able to see it? I had answered in the chat that if we had a data set before 1945, we can compare it to this one to do a change detection.
Yes,
but,
yes. Yeah,
but again,
basically when you want to see a change, you should by in its minimum requirement is you should have at least 2 images. So the change has to be before and after. So that's a prerequisite in doing remote sensing. You need to have what's this 2 sets of images before and after. Then you can see the rerouting. It can be done. Is such that is only that you have to have a requisite, which is a before and after image. It's loading quite slowly. I don't know, probably the network is quite busy because it's pulling some data from Google itself. But last night it really just jumped easily into it. Okay, well, probably I'll just stop sharing the QGIS for now, but move into the other slides that's left. What are the applications? Because we have limited time. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's how you can actually use QGIS, which is a free and open source software. There's a lot of plugins that go with it. You can do a decent rendition of LiDAR data sets, which are also free and available based on the websites I just shared with you, or will share with you in a while. And you can do a decent job in manipulating and doing image processing and analysis with free and open source software and free and open source data sets of LiDAR. Now, if you may allow me, I'd like to continue with the applications of LiDAR, as we're waiting for some of the data sets to load into from the Google Map backdrop. Okay, applications of LiDAR quickly. It's quite evident that it has immensely huge applications in forestry mapping and inventory. Not to over exaggerate it, it's been an example in the QGIS demonstration already, that you can actually extract canopy height models from LiDAR data, with high precision. It's also useful in hydrology. You can actually map the meandering of rivers, as mentioned by one of the questions from the audience. Can you see the change or the redirection of a river? Yes, we can do that if we had two images before and after to see change detection in a particular area. Hydrology and flood monitoring, contour mapping. You can derive contour maps. If you need to produce contour maps for various applications, civil works, hydrological construction, and whatever, LIDAR is high precision mapping and can therefore be used for civil works and that kind of applications. Sea level rise modeling, okay, of course, which is the conference is anchored onto, which is islands are rising. Okay, it also can be used for sea level rise modeling, urban mapping, high-tech urban mapping. That is, you can actually image three-dimensional portrayals of buildings. Archaeology, which is the main objective of my involvement into the GPT Atantano reserve analysis, is basically we're trying to see if we can be able to image some linear features that are present in Atantano and somewhat do a preliminary investigation if there are objects which you can actually identify using LIDAR and would be suspects or possible suspects for archaeological finds like latte stones or whatever. Okay, which we've been having some finds recently with the groundworks and ground movement that's happening in the north, up in the north. Agriculture, of course, is another useful application of LIDAR, not only LIDAR, but remote sensing particularly. Okay, this is a quick run through of some of the things that you can do with LIDAR and their applications. Okay, this is a video on how LIDAR can actually slice through vegetation, remove it, and reveal structures which are somewhat hidden because of the thick vegetation that's present in a particular area. And most of the recent finds, archaeological finds in many parts of the world, were actually done or discovered using LIDAR. Okay? And this is one of them, linear structure, which would have otherwise been invisible if they did not use LIDAR. Okay? Quickly again.
Times of each life pulse.
This is a bit of a long.
You can't see your screen. You have to share your screen, Dr. Aban.
Oh yeah. I'm so sorry for that. I forgot to do that. I'm so sorry. Just so engrossed with speaking. Sorry. I'm so
No, I thought you were just waiting for the data sets to load and you were just lecturing. I didn't realize that there was a slide.
Yeah, there is a slide that actually that's moving on my side. Okay, here. I'm so sorry for that. I inadvertently wasn't able to share my screen. Are you seeing now? Are you seeing it?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So I was citing a while ago some of the applications quickly, and these are just some of the lists. And I have some special videos which would portray LIDAR in archaeology, like this one. It actually slices off and removes vegetation that's covering most of the recent archaeological finds that they have worldwide. Most of them are actually discovered using remote sensing, particularly using LIDAR technology. Okay. Okay. I'll show. Yeah, it's a long video, so I'll skip that. LIDAR in agriculture, my previous work, I was involved with a lot of remote sensing, and we were in the verge of using LIDAR for trees counting because it gives you a distinct shape for a canopy. In this case, we were trying to use LIDAR and remote sensing technology to count palm trees, which is a source of palm oil, a source of industrial palm oil, particularly coming from Indonesia. So it can actually be used to exact trees counting or inventory. So here is another image. I think this is an orchard of mangoes. Okay, I just don't know where this area was, but it's basically being used to count mangoes. And coupled with remote sensing satellite data, you can actually assess conditions or health of the trees. In this case, you can assess the health of palm oil trees in this particular plantation. Okay, LIDAR in sea level rise, you can do modeling, since we are basically dealing with high precision, high accuracy DEMs. You can do a lot of modelings and see which areas can get flooded given different scenarios of sea level rise. In this case, this is the Key West that's being modeled in terms of inundations or sea level rise, and which areas in the Key West can actually be inundated by a sea level rise of this magnitude, or different magnitudes rather. Okay. Sea level rise modeling, it can also be used for urban mapping. Okay. This is a short video on how LIDAR is used for coming up with the dimensional view of the LIDAR in hydrology, particularly flood modeling. Okay, can also is one of the tools that was actually implemented by the Philippine government some years ago, because Philippines is quite prone to flooding, especially in cities where infrastructures are basically devastated by floods, and areas where you have big rivers. LIDAR has been used to map most of the big rivers and main rivers in the Philippines. And you can do modeling which areas will get flooded using high definition, high precision terrains, DTMs. So this is a modeling of flooding in a particular city. Okay. Scenario building, which areas will be flooded by a certain height of flood or inundation. Okay. Of course, forest inventory, that's been conveyed quite detailed and clearly in a demo a while ago. But again, this is a nice video. This is sponsored by Esri, developers of ArcGIS, and they're using drones equipped with LIDAR to 3D model. It's a long video, so I'll just skip that. Most importantly, what are the free LIDAR DM data sources? Again, this is not exhaustive. This is just some of the sites that I would usually frequent to get not only LiDAR data, but satellite data as well. NEON, NSF, it has been mentioned in the previous slides. NEON stands for National Ecological Observatory Network, which is heavily using LiDAR to do an extensive inventory of forests in the United States. Their website is shown here. It's funded by the NSF. WERI, of course, hosts a lot of DEMs, high definition, high precision DEMs derived from several LIDAR, flights that have been done over Guam. So WERI has an extensive list of DM derived from LiDAR that's hosted by the website itself. NOAA Digital Coast, there's a free and online site you can actually go through, and shown in this particular link. And for the LiDAR data, it shows here, also hosted by NOAA. This is a complete set of LiDAR that's been taken off Guam. Okay, I think it's 2012, right, Romina?
Correct. And I put the link in.
So those are all LiDAR data sets that's been quality controlled by NOAA. Okay. USGS, of course, is a favorite place I would frequent for satellite data as well as LiDAR data. They host quite a number of archive data over there. You just have to spend some time to really exhaust the huge repository of data that they have. G-Topo30 is actually a predecessor of high definition LiDAR. G-Topo30 basically is a low resolution DEM. It's been used before high precision LiDAR was actually available. And G-Topo30 provides 30 meter by 30 meter resolution pixels. That means each of those pixels that you see on these tiles of DEM represent a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel resolution. So for medium to low resolution DEM modeling, G-Topo30 is also useful for you to use. Okay. If you're starting with DEMs, this was where I actually started with doing rendition, G-Topo30. And of course, again, another site of USGS, which is USGS EROS. Again, a lot of archived data that's in the repository. You just have to exhaust and spend some time to really see in each of those layers that are available and free to use publicly. Actually, that's the end of my slide, but I have to switch again to see if the QGIS was actually able to. Oh, there's an error message. It unexpectedly, which I was not expecting to happen. There was an unexpected error with QGIS. Okay. Anyway, let's pull it out again. 3.1 QGIS. QGIS 3.16. I can take in questions while I load up QGIS again. By some unknown factor, the QGIS actually rebooted itself. Yeah.
Also, to be mindful of time, we have this ending at 5 o'clock, and there's 6 minutes left until 5 o'clock.
Yes.
Dr.
Yes. Actually, I'm done with the slides. It's just that I wanted to show the what's this? The rendition of 3D rendition of QGIS over a Google Map. But I'm done. I'm done with the lectures itself. I mean, with the slides. I'm done with the slides.
Okay, so now is a great time to maybe field some questions from people. Please raise your hand for the under reactions. And if you can, John Borja will be releasing a poll just for us to gauge how you felt about our webinar so that we can improve for future technical webinars. So just be on the lookout for that poll. That should pop up very soon. There it is. The poll is out. Go ahead. Please tell us how helpful this workshop was for you. We hope it was helpful. And the poll is going to end in 20 seconds. So there's about 5 of you left who haven't voted. So please vote, because the more information we have, the better we can do in the future. Okay, 3 more of you, 83% of you have voted. 16, only 2 left. Okay. I'm going to end the poll because I think the other 2 are me and Dr. Aban. We're going to share our results.
It's been helpful to me. So I'm biased.
Great. Oh, thanks, guys. 1 of you are neutral. 4 of you found it helpful, and a lot of you found it. Oh, we're so happy. We will be doing more of these types of technical webinars. You know, this was LIDAR. We might do a LIDAR, another LIDAR one, or we might do a multispectral imagery one. So thank you again for sharing your feelings with us. And now I'm going to open the floor up for questions. Do we have any questions? Let's see. We have a question from Mario in the chat. He's asking about NDVI, which it would be multispectral. So you have to stay tuned for the next webinar, because NDVI would be multispectral imagery,
Yes,
not
yeah. It's not the area of LIDAR. It's a totally different, how do you say that? It's a totally different animal. It's a totally different monster. No, it's not a monster. It's a very tame monster. No, it's a different way of processing and interpreting NDVI. By the way, just to check, are you seeing the 3-dimensional rendition of the area of Atantano? You see,
yes, we are.
Those peaks are actually representative of the trees. This is vegetation layer. Okay, so that's the vegetation layer. So if I click on the ground, it's quite slow, yeah. So here, okay, you can actually see different renditions.
And this is a vertical exaggeration of 2, correct?
Yeah, this vertical exaggeration of 2. So if I remove the exaggeration, okay, say go to the exaggeration of just 1, the normal one, okay, it should be somewhat looking like this. Okay. And hopefully, if I click on the Google hybrid map, there it is. Oh, so there was a glitch, somewhat of a glitch. So I've just rendered it together with the Google map backdrop, okay, and you can actually overlay it together, so you have your better, you would say, real world rendition of the area. And you can see some quite a distinct height that's shown by the trees. Can you see that on your side? So this is rendered together with a Google map, and using the masked this is just the vegetation, okay, over Google map. This is the height of the vegetation over the Google map, a vegetation that's derived from LIDAR. Okay, okay, one more minute and then my time is up. I think that's my presentation for now.
Thank you, Dr. Aban. That was great. One other thing that I'd like to kind of chime in on is that Dr. Aban and I are geographers and remote GIS and remote sensing professionals. And so when we analyze LIDAR, right, we can identify anomalies or things that we don't know what they are. And we require partnering with other experts, such as geologists, such as archaeologists, such as marine biologists, such as foresters. So that way the things that we're looking at, that we analyze and create, we know they would be the ones to say, okay, that is a sinkhole, or no, that is not a sinkhole, or, you know, we would just say we think this is a sinkhole, but we're not sure. We have to go out into the field and check. And so a lot of people have been asking us to share our digital elevation models that we create, and we have to emphasize that these digital elevation models that we make have not been field checked. We have not gone out into the field to see how accurate they are. So we are rather hesitant to share them in the event that people take our personal DEMs that we create and use them in some kind of report without that extra layer of QA QC. So just to also chime that in. Does anyone have any other questions? Anyone? Oh, Lynn Monsanto.
Hi.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Guy. Thank you. Yes, this is awesome. So, as always, you delivered very well. Okay.
Thank you
I have
so
a
much.
question.
Yeah.
I have a question. So LiDAR data is not able to differentiate between vegetation types, right? You can only determine the vegetation height and distinguish between the tallest species forest cover and the shortest forest cover, but not identify what kinds of species are in each of those forest covers.
Actually, I have to clarify that LiDAR has to go with a multispectral data, which in this case, multispectral can give you such information like NDVI, which was asked a while ago by Mr. Mario. So basically, LiDAR is one of several data sources which you can actually use to identify species. One thing that LiDAR can provide, which multispectral data may not be able to provide quite distinctly, is that of texture. So for example, if you have high precision, high resolution LiDAR, this can give you texture of the tree, in which case, say for example, texture of, say, a fine leaf tree can be discerned with LiDAR better as compared to just using multispectral independently. So a merging of those two sets of data, merging them together to come up with a better analysis in identifying species of trees would be a better approach. Okay, LiDAR is not a cure-all remedy for identifying species per se, but the texture that it provides together with the multispectral data that's coming from another source, merge them together, gives you a better identification of tree species. So they have to.
All right. Thank you.
Mario Garcia had his hands up.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Mario.
Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yes, we
Yeah,
can
my
hear you.
question is, can you use the photogrammetry with your LIDAR and with the NGVI to get a better classification of your vegetation species?
Actually, you don't. This is my personal opinion. You don't need photogrammetry when you already use LiDAR, simply because you have a three-dimensional rendition of the object itself. It has its length, width, and height, which you can actually get from photogrammetry. Photogrammetry makes use of two sets of images which have a certain overlap, and that overlap provides you the height, right? So in LiDAR, photogrammetry is actually eliminated simply because the objects already have its length, width, and height, which you get from photogrammetry. Now, the other question that goes with it was what?
Integrating it also with the NDVI for the vegetation classifications.
Yes, NDVI, as I said, is another source or is another type of data which you get from. It's a derivative from multispectral sets of data, which is not discussed here in this particular session. It's another animal, so to speak, to discuss on. And it works more on the infrared and red wavelengths of the spectrum, which I touched on a while ago at the beginning of this lecture, that there are certain wavelengths of the EMR to which we can actually use for mapping certain objects and certain substances. In this case, plants or vegetation are quite sensitive to infrared reflectance, and that's where we actually exploit in multispectral remote sensing and how we actually derive NDVI or normalized difference vegetation indices. Okay, now these derivatives, if we can combine NDVI together with LiDAR, then you have a better classification, so to speak, because you get the best of both worlds. You get texture information and height information from LiDAR, and you get multispectral or infrared photosynthetic behavior from multispectral, and join them together. And of course, you have two sources of data. You have a better classification of a particular object. In this case, the object we're looking at is vegetation. It can be joined. That's the beauty of remote sensing. You can join different sources of data.
I mean, I see that Mike Gowell turned on his camera. Mike, do you have a question? You're on mute. You're on mute, Mike Gowell. You're on mute. Unmute, Mike Gowell. Unmute first. Uh-oh. I think Mike Gowell is talking, but he doesn't realize that he's on mute.
There, I had trouble getting off the mute.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to thank you all and offer my appreciation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Thanks. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We know it's late. So if there are no other questions, we are happy to let everybody go. Oh, one more question. I think Mario has his hand raised up. Oh, no, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Sorry, I'm going to lower his hands for him. Okay. And I think that's it. So thank you guys again so much, and thank you to Dr. Shelton and the CIS crew for facilitating the technology for us. And we look forward to seeing a lot of you guys at the conference. And thank you again, Dr. Aban. That was great.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. And thank you for participating. And have a good day, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. And yes, and also stay tuned. John Borja will be sending out a thank you email with the links that we had provided in the chat. So, so thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Hopefully you have use for this information. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you, moderator, Dr. King and John, and everyone who organized it. Dr. Leslie Aquino and Dr. Shelton as well. Thank you. I'm signing off.
Me too.